Joy to the World. It's pretty much a main staple Christmas carol in the church's catalog of favorite Christmas carols. But I don't know if you realize it wasn't even originally written to be a Christmas carol. It was really just written to be a hymn, and then it was kind of joyfully hijacked as part of our catalog of Christmas favorites. And I'm going to do a little bit of background, which I want to give props to a preacher named Ray Fowler, because my history of hymns and hymn writers is fairly limited. But I came across some things that I found very interesting about this great Christmas theme of joy and our favorite carol with that word, Joy to the World. It was written by Isaac Watts, who's widely regarded as one of the finest hymn writers in history. He wrote other hymns as well, Alas, and Did My Savior Bleed, Jesus Shall Reign Wherever the Sun, O God, Our Help in Ages Past, and probably the most famous, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, one that we use every Good Friday pretty much. He often wrote paraphrases of the Psalms for his hymns, and Joy to the World is actually based on a psalm. We're going to look at that in a few minutes from now. But basically, there's a line in Psalm 98:4, "Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth, burst into jubilant song with music." Joy to the World was published in 1719. It's a long time ago, but with a different melody than the one we have today. And 100 years later, another musician, composer fused it with this tune that he had. He had written this tune that took parts from Handel's Messiah and a few other things, and he named this tune Antioch, and he didn't have any words to go with it, and he discovered that the words to Joy to the World fit perfectly with this tune. But it's interesting, for 100 years there was this hymn, and then they put this new sounding melody to the 100-year-old hymn, and that's the only way any of us even recognize it or own it. So I'm just putting a dig in there in case you're a person who, they take these great hymns and they put a new tune into it. I don't like that. And you can say to them, like Joy to the World? Because they changed that 100 years later. Anyhow, what's ironic, like I say, is that Watts never even meant for it to be a Christmas song. And the hymn's really an Old Testament psalm mixed with New Testament language. And the hymn probably describes Jesus' sacrifice and his second coming even more than it does his birth. But the fact that it's all joy and that idea of the angels saying joy to the world and all of that kind of stuff, we really do associate it with Christmas, which is fine. But I'd like you to think a little bit about who is Isaac Watts. And again, this isn't just facts for facts' sake. I think this person, first of all, is very interesting. But secondly, the era in which he lived, I think, really applies to ourselves. I've talked about this Advent being a little strange. Like if we ever needed Advent, this is a year we need it. And you'll see what I mean in a couple of minutes. So who was this man, Isaac Watts? He was raised in an academic setting. And he was born in Southampton, England in 1674. I just discovered in this year, never knew where my ancestors came from. My great-grandfather came here as an orphan, and this is the area he was from, so I found that interesting. His father ran a boarding school out of his home, so young Isaac was raised in a highly academic setting. He was homeschooled, but there were other kids at his home school. He was surrounded by other students and exposed to learning. He began learning Latin at the age of 4. You know Latin, Bo? Bo, do you know Latin? No? Oh, how embarrassing, Scotty. Anyhow, he was a poet and a wordsmith. He inherited his love of poetry from his family. And his parents and grandparents also wrote poems. But Isaac's habit of always rhyming things annoyed his parents. You got a kid like this? So much that at one point his father told him no more rhyming in the house. And then he forgot and he started rhyming again. So his father was about to discipline him. And young Isaac cried out, "Oh, Father, do some mercy take, and I will no more verses make." That sounds like such a Boaz move right there. His poetry was so good that at one point his mother thought he was stealing them from somewhere. Didn't think he was really writing these poems himself. So when he was 7, how old's Lincoln? 7. So he's Lincoln's age. His mother sits him down at a table and says, write a poem right now where, she can see what's going on. So this is what he writes. I've got the slides up here. Remember, he's Lincoln's age. He's 7. I am a vile, polluted lump of earth. So I've continued since my birth. Although Jehovah grace does daily give me, as sure this monster Satan will deceive me. Come therefore, Lord, from Satan's claws relieve me. Wash me in thy blood, O Christ, and grace divine impart. Then search and try the corners of my heart, that I in all things may be fit to do service to thee and sing thy praises too. So this poem, it's amazing for its meter, imagery, vocabulary, rhyme, depth of meaning, theology. Look at the next slide. It's an acrostic. The lines spell out Isaac Watts. So this is when he's 7 and under pressure from his mother. When he was 16 years old, he complained about the hymns on the way home from church one day. You may remember doing that when you were 16. His father told him if he didn't like him, he should write something better. So Isaac took up the challenge and that afternoon wrote his first hymn based on Revelation 5, 6 to 12. You can look that up later. And his father was so impressed, he brought it with him to church that evening and they sang it as part of the service. That was his first hymn, but not his last, because he'd go on to compose more than 600 hymns and hundreds of poems before he died in 1748. 600 hymns. He also became a preacher. He was a minister of the gospel. He became a preacher at age 26, and his music and theological writings spread rapidly. So he became a little bit of a celebrity in the printed world. This attracted one fan named Elizabeth Springer, who proposed marriage to him by mail. But when Isaac accepted her proposal for marriage, she traveled in person to meet him for the first time. And when she met him in person, she got back on the train and went back home. So thus, Isaac became forerunner to online dating practices and advice, centuries before Al Gore invented the internet. I'll always show a picture first, right? Or I guess that was part of the story. Anyhow, fortunately for us, her loss was our gain because he continued on in his ministry and had a fruitful ministry and wrote all of those hymns. But a little bit about his times, because you think about this. This is the guy writing Joy to the World, had that kind of pain in his life that, I heard all the ahs about his lost love at the train station. Well, there's more to that in his times. This is when he was a preacher, when he was a writer, when he was writing hymns, when he wrote Joy to the World. It was a time of plague and uncertainty. That's our COVID connection. The great bubonic plague had wiped out so many people in England that in his childhood and his time living up, they're still living with the devastation of all of the missing people and people's families and all of the holes and all of the economic upheaval that came with the great plague in England. That was the time the guy lived who wrote Joy to the World. It was a time of great pressure to conform. There's a little bit of a religious freedom kind of issue going on in the world we live in today. And Isaac Watts' ministry happened during great pressure from the Church of England, who had kind of all of the control, and they were definitely connected with the courts. And Isaac Watts and his father, they were part of the nonconformist movement, which Baptist churches trace their roots through, where they felt they should be free to worship God as they find Scripture telling them to, rather than having to follow all of the order from the national church, the Church of England. So Isaac Watts' father was in jail as a result of preaching without the authority of the Anglican Church when Isaac was born. And his father would spend many years in jail all through Isaac's childhood and in the early years of his ministry because of the nonconformist movement. It was also a time of great persecution when you think about his father being in jail during all of that time. Now so we have like 2 of the 3 of those things possibly. It's an insult to portions of the world that are being persecuted for their faith to claim that what we're going through are we going to be allowed to be open? I don't even want to go there and considering that persecution. But it's interesting that the guy who wrote Joy to the World did so in a very difficult time. It's not what you would expect. Here's the summary from the article where I got a lot of that whole idea. This is what the author wrote. It would be easy to think that Isaac Watts lived in simpler times in which it would be easy to write a hymn such as Joy to the World. But Isaac Watts wrote Joy to the World not because he lived in easy times, but because he read the Scriptures and had faith in the God of the Bible. We have the same Scriptures and we serve the same God, and so now we're going to turn in our Bibles to Psalm 98, and we're going to take a look at this psalm that talks about where this joy comes from. And if you can just think of these 3 steps, then you'll know what this sermon was about. That this joy that we're talking about starts in close and locally, just among God's own people, but then it vibrates like a sound. If you think about shouting and singing, these are sound vibrations that go out from our mouths and continue to travel till someone else hears it. Well, in this hymn, and in fact, in this psalm, I should say, and in the hymn, Joy to the World, there's this idea of it starting from just within the community of faith and spreading out into the whole wide world of all nations and all people, ultimately to the entire created world. So if Joy to the World is a Christmas carol, the way we use it, it should be for the idea of a cosmic Christmas. A cosmic Christmas, that God's people shouting for joy and sharing it, the entire world should hear about this, and then ultimately the big thing we anticipate in the future is the entire creation experiencing the joy that comes from this one same message. There's 3 verbs in this psalm that, as I read them, that I want you to watch for. I think they are sing, shout, and resound. And the singing is describing God's people. The shouting for joy is everybody in all the world, and the resounding is the sound made by all of creation. So let me just read this psalm, and then we'll make some comments on it. Sing a new song to the Lord, for He has done wonderful deeds. His right hand has won a mighty victory. His holy arm has shown His saving power. The Lord has announced His victory and has revealed His righteousness to every nation. He has remembered His promise to love and be faithful to Israel. The ends of the earth have seen the victory of our God. Those verses talking about the things that God did to save Israel. We'll talk about what that saving was, and that's an amazing thing that brings great joy. And the other people saw that happen for God's special people. Shout to the Lord, all the earth. Break out in praise and sing for joy. Sing your praise to the Lord with the harp and melodious song, with trumpets and the sound of the ram's horn. Make a joyful symphony before the Lord the King. Talking about the God of Israel as the world's God. Israel's king is king of the entire world. The entire world should shout for joy based on what God's doing. And then look at this last stanza. Let the sea and everything in it shout His praise. Let the earth and all living things join in. Let the rivers clap their hands in glee. Let the hills sing out their songs of joy before the Lord. For the Lord is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world with justice and the nations with fairness. Our psalm kind of starts with this line, sing a new song. Sing a new song to the Lord. I don't know if you grew up in a house like mine, but I don't know if your parents used the term, you need to change your tune. Anybody ever heard that from your parents? You know, you're kind of getting ungrateful, you're complaining. Justine says, I heard it. Now she knows where I got it, because I heard that as a kid too. You know, your parents say, you need to change your tune. Well, our psalmist is being a little more positive than that. That's not the kind of idea he says when he says sing a new song. And he is talking about the fact God has done something amazing, and that changes your whole perspective. I also remember as about a 14-year-old, I was thinking about Isaac Watts complaining about the hymns when he was 16. I remember being 13 or 14, standing beside my dad in church, and he's singing away in a way that, yeah, he's not a great singer. But I can remember standing there just being too cool to sing. You know, it's like, I'm going to stand here, but I'm not going to sing. So I think, in my memory, I think I saw some like 17 or 18-year-old guy that I thought was really cool, and he wasn't singing, so I'm not going to be cool, and I'm not going to sing. And my dad's honking away with his nasally voice, you know, and then he just stops and he says to me, "What's the matter? Didn't God ever give us something to sing for or sing about?" And, it wasn't the most positive parenting advice right there, but it stuck with me. It hit me. There's a little bit, that should be a little bit of our reaction when we hear a psalm like Psalm 98 and realize, God's given us so much to sing about and praise Him for. In the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a plague, in the middle of whatever. We have many things to sing for. Let's think about it. What is this salvation? He says the reason that you should sing a new song is because of God's has won a mighty victory, His saving power. He's revealed His victory, revealed His righteousness to every nation. He remembered His promise to love and be faithful to Israel. Other translations use the actual word salvation. Well, what is this salvation they're talking about? When you and I, as New Testament Christians, we talk about salvation, we might talk about when a person was saved, when they entered into a personal relationship with Christ. What does it mean in the Old Testament? Well, it almost always either means the Exodus or the return from exile. Those are the two great acts of God that God did on behalf of His nation. Salvation is the right word because both of those things were huge acts of God's power and His sovereignty. The nations were crying out for God to save them from their situations, and it could only be described as something that God did. People struggle a lot with a lot of the warfare and battle and the man-to-man combat in the stories of the Old Testament, especially when they're taking the Promised Land at the end of the Exodus and they're going into the Promised Land. But it's interesting that the two greatest victories in the Old Testament, which are the Exodus and the Israelites being brought back from exile, in both of those cases, not a shot was fired. What I mean by that is God did it all. It was by His mighty right hand. The entire nation, large, hundreds of thousands or millions of them by head count, all brought either out of slavery and bondage in Egypt just by a mighty act of God. There wasn't a slave revolt. This isn't this isn't Spartacus. This is slaves being freed by a mighty act of God. The same with being brought back by exile. In that case, it wasn't a bunch of plagues, but suddenly an occupying nation, mighty kings that had them in exile, kind of have them as part of their economy, they just changed their mind. If you take a look at the book of Nehemiah or Ezra or these stories, you see God moving the hearts of pagan leaders that had all the power, and they're like, yeah, okay, take a bunch of people and go back and rebuild the walls or rebuild the temple. And their prayers were answered in a different way than in the Exodus. In both of those cases, it's a mighty act of salvation that only God did. And so the psalmist says, in either of those cases, thinking about it, the children, this psalm might be written 100 years after either of those things, or hundreds of years after. But they were all to think about that as part of their story. God saved us in this way. So it's time to sing a new song. It's time to change your tune when you think about what God has done for us. Well, what was the old tune? Well, I would say the old tune, that's properly called a lament. Cries of pain and anguish and calling on God, a bluesy kind of song. And this psalmist is saying to them in that day, and I'm saying it to you as you think about what God's done in your life, We're to sing a new song. One of my favorite songs by U2 from one of their, about their third album is a song called 40. That's just the name of it, 40. And it's actually just Psalm 40 squeezed through 4 young Irish kids, And that's what this song is. And in the refrain, after they sing through Psalm 40, the refrain goes, I will sing a new song. I will sing a new song. It's really beautiful, going on and on. And then it switches. And it's this longing cry. How long to sing this song? And that's a beautiful kind of artistic entering into the spirit of Psalm 98, Psalm 40 in that case. Like there's this anticipation, the joy is I'm going to sing a new song, but then at the same time, how long to sing this song? And I think that's another way that you could be thinking about this. So I don't want you to hear me as I talk about joy and I talk about Psalm 98 and I talk about all the great things that God's done for you. I don't want you to just hear me say, so suck it up. Change your tune. Have a better attitude. Don't worry, be happy. God's done all these proper things for you. No, because there's so much more that still needs to be redeemed. Anybody's entire family been really redeemed? Have all your relationships been put back together so that they just perfectly reflect God's original intent for relationships? Pandemic over yet? Got enough money at the end of the month instead of month at the end of the money? It's not all been made right yet. And so there are times when we have to kind of discipline ourselves and tell ourselves, I will sing a new song. How long to sing this song? That could be a pattern for your prayers even this week as you think about this whole idea of joy. Before I move on to the next verb, let me mention this. I mentioned that this is very Israel-specific at this point. Well, all of Israel's stories and all of the things God did for them in the Old Testament, they were very real. They really happened. They were really worth Israel singing a new song and singing songs of joy and jubilation and all of those things. But the things that God did in their lives were never just completely about what happened during their lives and during that time. There are ways that all of these stories are fulfilled and are part of our narrative and our history, and they pointed forward to a greater day. Our little video at the beginning talked about this anticipation that, you saw the little cartoon, and there's Isaiah writing about this great deliverer that was going to come, and his ministry and his time would bring great joy. And so even though the first 4 verses of this are really talking to the nation of Israel, their God is the God of the world. Their God is our God. That's our family history back there in that day. And there's a future fulfillment of all of these things that bring us great hope and great joy moving forward. And then there's this talk about the whole world clapping. What's all that about? How does the earth clap? How does the sea and everything in it resound is my word that in most translations. How does it shout its praise? Let the earth and all living things join in. Rivers clapping their hands in glee. Hills singing out their songs of joy before the Lord. What's all that about? Well, here's the thing about all of creation. It's pretty messed up. Wouldn't you agree? We've got environmental disasters, and this is something where critics of the Christian faith, of people who believe in the Bible, they sometimes pin this on religion. Dr. Suzuki, he's a very interesting man, great Canadian, very interesting story. I heard him on the radio once saying, the global warming and the environmental problem, a big source of this is the kind of ancient, outdated idea that God in the Bible gives man dominion over the creation, so men have been dominioning all of these years, and that's what's caused all of these disasters, and basically pins it on all of that. I disagree with Dr. Suzuki. I do agree. We all bear responsibility for it. I do agree in the book of Genesis that you can look at that and find out how we're all responsible for the sickness of the environment around us. But it's not from Genesis 1 where man's given dominion. It's from a little later in Genesis. when men have brought sin into the world. And the word given to Adam and Eve in that is that the cursed is the ground because of you. Cursed is the ground because of you. That's what our Bibles tell us happened to the world through our sin. So we are responsible for it. And that's why God's work of redemption is going to make even the creation. This redemption is not just for our ticket out of ending up in the bad place and ending up in the good place. It's God's plan to redeem and restore everything. The book of Romans has this to say. It says that the entire creation is groaning. Let me find it here. Romans chapter 8 says that what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory He will reveal to us later. For all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who His children really are. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. We sometimes say, there's no innocent party in the effects of sin, like we're all guilty. It's true for people. But this planet that we love that's so beautiful has suffered as a result of our sin. There's that line in Romans. Where did I get lost now? Suffer nothing compared to the glory He'll reveal. Against its will. Okay, there we were. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. For we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Groaning is in the pains of childbirth. We have a friend who, Justine's a lifelong friend, Katie, living as a missionary on the other side of the world. We're all worried about her. She was due to have a baby and had a beautiful little baby girl. So, she and Justine do everything together. They have boys the same year, 2 times, and now they both have girls the same year, all of this kind of stuff. But her husband wrote that at a certain point, Katie was saying, I can't do this. Some of you that have delivered children, you remember that feeling. It was beyond her. She was starting to panic. And her husband was like, what do we do if she can't do this? Like, he was in this giant panic, and he's explaining this stress at the crisis moment, and then the joy that came when this baby arrived. Now, he's probably not the guy to be writing quickly. It was all so worth it. But, we all have that feeling, right? The creation, the redemption of God's created world is going to be like that kind of childbirth. And it's going to be so beautiful and new and fresh and perfect. And that's something that we look forward to. But this psalm also talks about judgment. For the Lord is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world with justice. I want to go back to a famous part of our New Testaments, and that's John chapter 3. We all love to quote, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him will not perish, but have everlasting life. But Jesus goes on in that same chapter. You can take a look at it later in John chapter 3, and He talks about judgment. He does say, for God didn't send His Son to judge the world, but that, basically the world could be made right, but judgment happens. Jesus says in that passage, anyone who doesn't believe in me has been judged already. Has been judged already. And God sent His Son into this world, and in the end, He's going to die on a cross to meet the price of sin. That's the part of this psalm that kind of connects with the Lord's Supper, is that in our Bibles, pastors like me, we do a lot of work to come up with 4 or 5 weeks of messages on a little sliver of Jesus' life story, His arrival stories. If you think about it in your New Testament, the Gospel of Mark completely skips it. Skips 30 of Jesus' 33 years on life and just starts when He begins His ministry. Matthew Luke and John, John kind of really only talks about Jesus' arrival in kind of philosophical terms. That's that Logos passage, beginning was the Word and the Word was God. So we only have Matthew and Luke even covering Jesus' arrival stories. And yet, the last week of his life, his suffering, his death, huge amount of ink. Huge amount of ink. The Gospel of John, almost half the book. Matthew, about a third. All of the Gospels have a huge focus on Christ's death and suffering. Here's this idea of the world being under a curse and being under judgment. So our real joy, the fact that Christ arrived as a baby in Bethlehem is cause for great joy, but it's what he's going to do. Not just that he arrived, but that he arrived, he was who he was, he did what he did, he paid the price on the cross that he paid, and he dealt with that whole theme of judgment. Here's how the book of Hebrews says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Remember this idea of sing a new song? I'm going to read it again. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. The book of Philippians says that for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. If there's not a huge example of, I will sing a new song, how long to sing this song? For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. At this point, I want us to change over to the Lord's Supper, and I'm going to ask you to start from the front and go and grab your elements at the table. Start at one end and just so that you're not reaching across, and grab your 2 cups. And Janine, if you could get me 2 as well while you do. I'm going to give you a second to be doing that. While you're doing it, keep listening, because I'm going to read the lyrics of Joy to the World. I'm going to read the lyrics of Joy to the World while we're preparing for communion and while you're getting your stuff. Without the happy, upbeat song that we're singing, think of this. We're told when we meet together for the Lord's Supper to prepare our hearts, right? To have ourselves ready and think about what's going on. To think about the fact that this is how Jesus showed his disciples that he was making a new covenant between God and man. How the curse was going to be dealt with finally and completely. So with the Lord's Supper in mind, listen to these words. Joy to the world. The Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room. That's what we're doing right now around the Lord's table. And heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. Joy to the world, the Savior reigns. Let men their songs employ. It's like, put your songs to work. Apply them. Raise them up when you think about what Christ has done for us. And then while we're doing that, the hymn says, while fields and floods, rocks, hills, and plains repeat the sounding joy. You know, what we're thinking about here around the Lord's table has cosmic implications. It's this theme of a cosmic Christmas. That it is about our salvation. It is about our being made right with God. But we're part of an overall story where everything is being made right with God. And we also have the joy and the praiseworthy idea that we are spared judgment because of what Christ has done. No more let sins and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. There's the line about the curse. And the ground is cursed because of us. No more let thorns infest the ground. He comes to make his blessings flow far as the curse is found. If the entire planet has been cursed because of sin, Christ's new covenant has come, and it is to be spread as far as the curse is found. Well, guess what? That's everywhere. Aren't we often aware of that? Incredible hope. He rules the world with truth and grace. Be thankful this morning around the Lord's table for both of those words, truth and grace. Imagine if Christ's rule over my life, I'll just go myself rather than speak for you. Can I imagine if Christ's relationship with me was only based on the truth of what he knows of my human condition? But he rules me with truth and grace. By faith through grace, I've been made right with God, and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness and wonders of his love. And wonders of his love. We are outsiders of God's original chosen people. But he's proven his love by making us able to be called children of God. God's elect, chosen by God. All of those things. God's made his righteousness and his love known to all of us.